Hello, welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Artemis, who is a transsexual of female biology. And in this conversation, we talk about Artemis's transition and the political / personal valence of a trans identity. Definitely check out Artemis's work on YouTube and elsewhere, which is linked down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Artemis. I'm sorry. I just want to jump into the interview. Do you mind?
Whatever you'd like. I'm open to it. Absolutely.
Because I hear questions in my head and then I have to ask them. But some people like preambles and stuff like that.
I'm rather open to whatever your process is. I appreciate it.
What are your thoughts, or what is your relationship to, or about the relationship between your lived experience or identity and politics? Like, the trans identity is now a political identity, almost first and foremost now, because the way that things have shaken out over the last 5 years. How do you navigate that? Or
so maybe I'm a bit different in this way. I tend to, in some ways, carefully tread the line between being aware of what's going on in the outer world and then also attempting to stay somewhat sheltered and cut off from it. And I do that after I had come across some musings by Schopenhauer, who had mentioned that there's only so much reading that may be helpful for you to do on other people's ideas and influences before it starts to so much influence your own thoughts that it becomes prohibitive to you coming up with your own thoughts and ideas. So as far as the relationship to the political scene, what is now, like you said, the idea that is transgenderism or the trans identity, I sit weirdly apart from that for myself, knowing full well that when I interact with people, that they are going to have a lot of their own perceptions about that, typically based on, what they've seen, what's been created, within the socio-cultural scene. So it's difficult because if you don't have the space to have the one-on-one conversations with people to break through that. But I attempt to anyway, at least with the conversations that I have individually with my clients, or people that I interview with, because I feel like that's really the only way that I can sort of bridge that gap and begin to what I see as affect any kind of net positive change. Basically clean up your own corner first, be the example. I don't know if that answers your question very well.
Well, follow-up question. What do you mean by making things more positive then? Like, what is the general direction?
Sure. Honestly, at the end of the day, for me, what this boils down to is just giving people a space to express all of their fears, worries, concerns. I mean, these are often things that will dictate someone's behavior if they're not being conscientious of it. And, we go day to day, maybe not realizing that so much of what we choose to do is based in that. And so my goal, I think anyway, would be more positive for people, would be to give them a space to talk, non-judgmentally, comfortably, really thoroughly explore feelings that maybe they don't necessarily feel comfortable with even themselves, or especially, expressing that to somebody else. And giving that sense of, it's okay, because we've all got all sorts of things that go on inside our heads day to day that, unless we have a paid therapist, maybe, and even then we wouldn't allow to see the light of day. And I think that causes a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, a lot of all sorts of, warped coping mechanisms that if we were just allowed to talk about it without somebody, breathing down our neck, jumping down our throat, and any number of things, a negative response, that we might unwind ourselves a little bit, learn something about ourselves, and then in doing so, be able to have, empathy for other people. So that's in general what I aim to do, with every conversation that I have. it often, does come down to sex and gender. That's, I think, a crucial aspect of our existence, but it certainly doesn't have to be. That just tends to open the door to people being able to talk about what they consider taboo subjects, or
Mm.
so.
What's your definition of gender?
Oh boy. So I have come to see gender as a very multifaceted thing, which in some ways does make it difficult to define. But the core of it for me is to call it typically what we might consider, masculine and feminine. So when we talk about gender, it would be in terms of what's, masculine or feminine. And each of those things, characteristics, can be defined by biological characteristics. They can be defined by social or cultural characteristics. And in that way, it does make it very difficult to say this is, this or the other. It can shift in some ways, depending on the way that we look at it, which is to me endlessly fascinating. And to me, there really is no right or wrong, honestly, there. Some of it has a basis in biology, like masculine characteristics might be a chiseled jawline. There are females that have chiseled jawlines. That doesn't make them male. It's just masculine. We would associate that typically because physically and anatomically, that's usually what you see. Of course, general. So there's that biology, but again, it's general. And then there's cultural. Some cultures would consider long hair on a male to be perfectly acceptable, if not attractive. Whereas other cultures would say, no, that's prohibitive to whatever it is that males typically do. So we see males with short hair as being the standard of masculinity. So, if that helps to answer your question at all, I've thought about it quite a bit, but it can be kind of difficult to, really fully define.
Yeah. When did the thought first enter your head, do you think?
As far as like how to define gender?
Just considering gender, considering I'm a
Oh,
boy, I'm a girl, I don't want to be a girl, I am a girl, that's a boy, this is what a boy is, this is what a girl is.
sure. And that for me is so crucial to separate, for starters, that, sex and gender, for me anyway. I think it's useful to define those two things as different, even though in places like the DSM, they conflate the two, which makes it all the more difficult to have these
Hmm.
conversations. So for me, sex would be, like you said, boy, girl, male, female. It has to do with, the typical genitalia presentations of those two sexes. Um, and so I never, here's the interesting thing about my history is that I never really considered the whole, am I a boy or am I a girl? At least I don't think so anyway. I will give the full disclaimer that I don't have a ton of recollection that I really had that kind of self-awareness at that age, or really even through my teenage years, honestly. I I went through a lot of it fairly dissociated. I was a very left brain logical individual,
Hmm.
which in some ways now I'm understanding might have slight autistic tendencies, but it's not a formal diagnosis in any way. It's just me doing my research. But I never really had that sort of consideration. And perhaps because I grew up without the internet, without exposure to really any of those ideas, are you a boy, are you a girl, masculinity, femininity, none of those things entered my realm of introspection, or consideration for that matter. So I actually didn't even begin to consider all of these until I had later in life, rather, I came out as a lesbian actually when I was 20. Oh gosh, I think I was like 28 years old or something like that. I was closeted for quite some time, and even had spent that whole first bit of my life just straight up denying my sexuality, for reasons that we can talk about or not. And so I hadn't even considered my own sexuality, much less an identity. I just knew that, everybody always said that I was very typical for male behavior, the way that I dressed and acted and looked at the world, and all those things. So I just thought, okay, so I'm a tomboy. That's, that happens, whatever. And it wasn't until I came out and then started to explore all of these things. Of course, I had the internet, but I never used it and connected socially or, in these Reddit groups or anything that a lot of these kids are having access to today and getting this gender ideology from. I didn't have that. I didn't dip into it. I was a workaholic, obsessed with my the things that I wanted to do in that way, and I was shut off. So I was rather pristine, you could say, and untouched from all that until I came out as lesbian when I was 28, and then started to come across some of this information like, oh, maybe there's more to this. Maybe I actually could keep going down this road. And at that point, this is after your prefrontal cortex development. I'm able to fully deploy all of the critical thinking and, reasoning and skills of logic and really started to dig into all of this ideology. And for myself, I realized that I did not have that early onset gender dysphoria like many transsexuals claim to have at a young age, 5, 6, 7. I knew that I was, born in the wrong body. I didn't have that, but I still had this, well, I think, I act, I behave, I do all sorts of things that people have attributed to, in general, male behavior. What if I might actually benefit from some of these things that are typical medicalization for transgender people? And so I essentially decided, well, I went through pros and cons of everything and decided to start walking it forward step by step with the cross-sex hormones, essentially treating myself as a full-blown experiment, which some people might think that's very strange. But for me, after thinking it through, I thought, all right, I think I could do this. I want to do this, actually.
Hmm.
And so I started considering sex, gender, and everything else along with that when I was, when I was 28, 29 years old, sat on it for a year, 2 years with all the research, and then proceeded with it when I was 31.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
What was the allure of the, I guess, the whatever you would gain or lose from the cross-sex hormones?
Sure. So, I had another little tidbit about my past. I had been on birth control actually since I was, goodness, it might have been 14, maybe 14 or 15. And strictly because my menstrual cycle was so miserable for me that I was not functional, in a ton of pain. And, no matter what I did, nothing was helping. And so I'd started that at 11. I was missing school, and extracurriculars. So
Hmm.
it was suggested that I go and go on birth control to try to regulate some of this and even get to the point of actually skipping my menstrual cycle, which did help me tremendously. However, um, I had, when I was again 27, 28 years old, I just hit a breaking point that something within inside me said, I need to stop this hormone treatment because something is not right. This does not feel right to me. And I couldn't really put my finger on it. And I stopped taking it. I went off of it. And within 2 weeks, my everything about my mental everything just turned upside down. And that's the only way that I can kind of describe it to you, is that I just felt completely lost, and that I was not heading in the right direction for myself. And so
Well,
after
did you
having
not know who you were, or did your values shift, or what?
well, up until that point, I had been in the relationship with a very toxic relationship, unfortunately, with someone who was not of the correct sex for my sexuality. Again, I was living in pretty deep denial of all of that, and just knew that whatever I was doing, whatever I was masking, was not being authentic to myself, whatever that actually was. And as I, would later come to find out, I was suppressing a lot of that for fear of upsetting or disappointing, family, and just having grown up in a very, it's a cult. It was a familial cult, not in the official, like we were Scientology or anything like that, but the whole, your family unit, you are absolutely enmeshed in that. And it's not entirely safe to be whoever you are within that family unit. There's that, again, that enmeshment that was occurring, that it was so buried deeply within me that it was entirely keeping me from fully differentiating myself. as an individual. So when I went off the birth control, that's when, I mean, all hell absolutely broke loose within me. And then over time, slowly that did alleviate a bit as I guess my hormones maybe stabilized to some degree. But having that in mind, knowing the power that hormones have on somebody in so many ways, I thought maybe my experience, my mental health could get better than I actually realize or that I can fathom at this point with cross-sex hormones if I happen to, think, behave, view the world in all of these ways more typically male. It might have something to do with my physiology, which we don't quite understand yet. Which for me, I recognize, no, I'm a biological female. I was born that way, of course. But what if, what if there are some, mutations that are not able to be seen with the naked eye that do happen to mesh better with cross-sex hormones that would lend some, you know, additional dimension to this theory of intersexuality and a greater expansion on what we come to see as what is male or, female, so to speak. And I believe in having some, distinct boxes for certain areas of application. It's just for me, it's always about, pushing the bounds of what we understand and what we know. Because despite what we think we know now, it's paltry compared to what we could understand. There's so much about the brain we don't understand or know at this point. And even if you look, 200 years ago, what we understood about science and anatomy and biology and physiology, it's comical, really. And so I know there's so much more to go. And so that's why all of this was just sort of very appealing to me. I just, with those sorts of, logic, yeah, I'm a biological female on the outside in some ways, but what if? So, and that's what kind of stepped me further down. And I mean, after I didn't get any of the negative experience that some females talk about when, they started on testosterone, thinking that that was the correct solution for them and realizing relatively quickly, no, this is not meshing well with my system at all. But for me, it was, I couldn't understand, couldn't fathom at that point how much better my life was going to get mentally than after I started taking the testosterone. I never had any of those, rage fits or, severe anything that was just depression or anything like that. None of that. In fact, just the opposite for me. So it's almost 5 years now on testosterone. I don't see myself as, to harken back to your question about identity, for me, this might sound sort of mystical, but there is no identity for me. I don't attach myself to any particular label. I'm a conglomeration of things that maybe to some people don't seem to make a whole lot of sense, but to me, it doesn't have to, really. It just is. So,
were you in an environment, either culturally or, your time and place, where when you were 11, 12, 13, 14, leading up to using birth control, where people investigated, your caregivers investigated if there were environmental factors to the distress around your menstrual cycle or dietary issues? Did they thoroughly check all the different ways that you could be benefited without hormonal interventions?
Sure. So it's from that period in my life, honestly, from, the time that I became aware of myself in much capacity, or I should say have any memory, was like 8 years old up until, almost that point of, me going off of birth control. My memory is not real distinct. And that could be because there was a lot of, again, distancing myself, dissociating, from just my day-to-day experience.
What was your imagination life? Sorry to interrupt. What was your your imagination or your intellectual life? Like, how did you, what did you get interested in? What did you do? Where did you live? Like in your head, fantasy novels, what kind of stuff?
Right. Yeah. I definitely noted that there were times when I would be extremely drawn to certain fantasy movies and I would just, sit in them for hours at a time. I would consume all sorts of, material about behind behind the scenes footage about certain fantasy movies that I really liked. Lord of the Rings comes to mind, or even, a little bit later, Pirates of the Caribbean. But
Really?
yeah, but I yeah, but I would pull back from that because I conscientiously realized, like, if I do this, I'm going to, throw off any goal or, wish or dream or thing that I'm trying to go for. I was always very driven for what I considered to be hardcore knowledge, which so I was the kid that would read the encyclopedia. That would sit there and memorize, and specifically animals were a huge thing for me. I would memorize the Latin names for the animals, but I didn't even have to spend much time doing it. It would just, I could rattle them off after I had read them once, and it just made sense to me. And I would talk about things from a very, typically that biology standpoint. That was always something that was more interesting to me. So I would sink a lot of my effort into just acquiring the knowledge. So as far as imagination goes, I avoided that largely. Why? I'm not really certain. But again, I think that's a bit more on the autistic spectrum from what I understand. It's very driven towards facts and special interest and focus, in that way.
Were you blocked in that, encouraged in that pursuits?
I do think it was a focus, of course, for my parents, for me to have a good education. My father had gone to flight school, to college, ended up joining the military, I believe, very, very shortly after I was born. And my mother, I mean, she was 17 when I was born, so it was a focus for her and both of them, really, to make sure that I was doing very good academically, because for them, that's how they saw success. And when you come from lower middle class, typically, from what I understand, that makes sense. So there was a very hard focus on, doing well in my studies. And so that's, again, I think maybe as a lot of kids wanting to impress their parents, live up to, whatever's asked of them, that's what I did.
Hmm.
So.
And how did that proceed once you got out of high school? Did you go to college? What did you sink your teeth into?
Yeah, so I actually, some of the pursuits that I had wanted were maybe typical of a young boy wanting to, go into the military or go into the police force, or, aggressive sort of things. And that was something that I had actually dealt with a bit as a young girl, that there was a fair amount of uh, want to be physical and be aggressive, actually, in some of those ways. I often found myself getting in challenges or fights, physical fights with boys, which was unusual, until I hit, fifth grade, and they could absolutely womp on me, and or that they, didn't want to because I was a girl. Either way, it was probably for the much better. But that was always within me. So, by the time I hit after high school, I had talked about to my father, because I quite looked up to him. I wanted to go into the military or do some of those things. And, he was very forward thinking at that point, and realizing I would absolutely just be mincemeat, especially in the branch that he was in the Marines, probably would have ended in all sorts of trouble for me. Had said, no, you're going to college. And so there really wasn't much of a choice for me. Not that
Hmm.
I had actively thought to do anything else. So Ohio State, I went for, pre-veterinary medicine, because animals were, my focus at the time. And what I came to later realize was essentially an escape for me. Dogs especially, and that whole relationship, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms that I could talk about.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to poke there. You
mm,
dogs
mm,
bring to my mind that you were able to connect. You were able to find friendship
sure. Yep.
through
Yeah.
them rather than with other humans or people of your
Yeah,
age.
so a lot of my relationships were, I did have a couple of female friends, close female friends. One of them whose father's farm I actually worked on, physical labor. I did physical labor through high school. And the other one, um, we had horses in common. So, we rode horses and did stuff like that. Um, But outside of that, a lot of the people that I would more often be talking to were actually my teachers, my high school teachers. After class, I would stay behind and I would talk to them because that just was always where I found more um,
Hmm.
fulfillment, I suppose, more connection.
Yeah.
So yeah, animals were just one of those things. Dogs, they'd been around since I was born, literally, and I understood their body language. I understood, it was very predictable for me, and it seemed to me at the time that there was that love there and that acceptance, period, no matter what, that kids just they want,
Yeah.
and that I
Without all
found
these
getting from dogs.
confusing social cues and
Sure,
gossiping and
sure,
all the vicissitudes of interhuman
right.
relations, right?
Right. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. And on top of even all of my peers knowing before I knew that I was different in the way that, any male that I tried to quote unquote pursue awkwardly because I thought that's just what you did. As it turned out, I joke, as it turned out, two of the three guys that I had pursued in high school turned out gay.
Huh.
And of course, flat out denied me at the time. I couldn't understand why, but they were picking up, I think, on something deeply biological or chemical or something like that. That it's just later in my life came to become very comical. But anyway,
Oh no, comedy of
yeah,
errors kind of thing. Well,
sure, yeah.
you said dogs or animals were an escape
Mm.
from what, and what flavor tea are we drinking today? Since you bring it
Oh,
up.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So my favorite is it's a blueberry blueberry flavored tea, blueberries and cream. My wife blends all of her own teas, and so I'm fortunate enough to have some pretty excellent flavors to choose from.
Hmm.
So yes, today we're having my go-to blueberries and cream. But
Mm.
anyway, yeah. So dogs.
Why did you
I'm
say the
sorry.
word escape?
Escape, yeah, absolutely. So, and this is hindsight 2020. When I
Okay.
say escape, at the time, I did not at all view it as that. I viewed it as that was, in some ways, my identity and sense of purpose. So I came into dogs. I did dog training, dog grooming. I started out wanting to go for veterinary medicine. For me, it was serving with the dogs, which I saw as the underdog. That I was serving somebody, something, someone that needed me, and
Hmm.
I was getting appreciation from them. And so my entire life revolved around dogs. And even further into college, I spent a lot of time doing rescue work with high kill shelters, and that became my identity. But then after getting married over time, getting exposed to some more of this, psychology and really digging deep about why I did what I did and, why I thought what I thought about what I was doing, where I was going, who I was to any degree. There hadn't been a whole lot of introspection at all up to that point. And so my life did a complete 180 again when I came out as a lesbian, and then I started to, understood that I needed to perhaps work through some things that I had not worked through, even becoming aware that there were things to work through
Hmm.
before I pursued any more of the medicalization. Worked through all of that in that 2 year period, and then still arrived at that same point. But
Hmm.
yeah, so the dogs were everything that having to do with them became me. So.
I might be kind of stuck in my own loop right now, and the way that I keep on framing things, or I might be picking up on something. I don't know. So I'm just bringing
Mhm.
my own thinking to the conversation right now. But
Yeah, sure.
connection, like you were able to be connected to dogs, and perhaps you formed a connection with them when you got off birth control. Your our bodies are the way in which we connect to life, and once you rearrange how your body's behaving, the hormones and the stuff, and it's I don't know if there's studies on this or if people have really taken, our society is at large has taken it really seriously, the impacts that birth control or hormone medication has on the development of one's personality, and especially if you're
Mhm.
doing that through your whole development, how does
Yeah,
that affect the brain? How does that affect
right.
your feelings? How does that affect, how you relate to everybody else? Because if you're fiddling with your body, you're fiddling with everything else.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
when you get off that birth control, you have to your primary mode of connection to the world being your body sends you in a loop. So you have to reconfigure everything. So I'm just wondering, you said you don't identify with identity. So identity, in another way of saying that, is identity is not the way that you make connection to
correct.
yourself and to other people. So what is that? How do you formulate how you connect to the world, how you connect to yourself, how you connect to other people? And I'm wondering, like, is there a religious framework that you've been dealing with, or a
Mm.
psychological framework?
So I'm personally of the belief that we our souls are eternal. This is,
Hmm.
we are having a human experience as a spiritual being, and so this is not going to be my only time here. It hasn't been my only time here, and I'm willing to let go of that, I guess, fear of death or fear of missing out, or really fear of a lot of those things, in
Hmm.
order to just experience things as they are and watch other people's response to me and see, what that does. So I recognize that, we can't get away from these labels and identity because we're consistently interacting with people, oftentimes on a subconscious level, based on these things. Um,
Hmm.
I have a feeling that I have certain predispositions that are just part of the avatar. This is the suit that I'm
Hmm.
in, and I'm led to do certain things because they are just part of the learning process, the unfolding. There is no right, wrong. It's just what is to be that person's experience, and then what they feel drawn to do as a result after that. Because it's never ending. Just because we die, it doesn't stop. But that's how I believe, and I think it keeps me from being all wound up in those sorts of things, so
Hmm.
I can just observe
Okay.
and play with it a little bit.
Have you always had that frame of reference, or how did that develop
um,
for you?
I think all of that again came to be that sort of development after I finally started accepting just what was with me rather than fighting it.
Hmm.
Because that's and so maybe to answer your question a little bit more directly from earlier, how dogs were my escape. I didn't have to focus on myself. I didn't have to reconcile with any of the truths of, you know, what accepting myself would have, in my outer environment, what sorts of relationships would end or
Hmm.
become more difficult, or even, what would I have at the end of that? I might be alone, considering all of these things, all of these fears, dredging them all up and really sitting with them and working with them.
Hmm.
Hardest thing ever in my life. And I spent, a total now of roughly 6 or 7 years, 7 years now doing it.
Hmm.
I wouldn't trade it for the world, though. And as far as I believe, it was all to happen precisely as it was, because to me, that's the hero's journey. It's one of the greatest stories you can ever
Hmm.
experience and live. So.
What medium did you end up using to work through this stuff? Was it internal thoughts? Was it writing? Was it some sort of dialogue or discourse with a?
I consumed an insane amount of material. Typically, it would be YouTube videos, people talking about their experience of everything from the transgender, transsexual side of it to what the spiritual side, what people have called dark night of the soul. I went through lectures from Stanford about evolutionary behavioral biology. So I went, that route, and then the spiritual route, and then, so many different ways to look at this problem. The vast majority of it for me was done within my head, and then also with the absolute incredible patience and saintlyhood of my wife,
Hmm.
who, when she came into my life, this was when all of that started to kind of unfold, essentially. And she had some training with trauma survivors, abuse survivors, had that psychological wherewithal at that point. that she was able to kind of graft some framework for me and directions really for me to start exploring things that I didn't think might be related, but definitely were. So without her illumination, it would have been, I imagine, a whole lot harder because I didn't have access to a therapist or anything like that. So it was, yeah, largely internal and with her help.
Hmm.
So,
There's your channel's tea time with
mm,
Artemis, and that tea has a lot of different a
mm.
lot's in that word, right? I don't know. You can
There's a,
even see a cross there,
yeah,
which might be
yeah,
yours
there's
to
a,
bear, but
sure.
yeah. So
Yeah,
there's
the choice was very
testosterone, there's
intentional.
T, but there's also trauma. You brought up trauma,
Mm,
that T word.
yeah. Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, broadly, just as a framework, and then how that helps that way of looking at things, whatever trauma is to you. How thinking about it as this thing called trauma has helped
Mhm.
you to develop through it,
Mhm.
overcome it, understand it,
Mhm.
accept it,
Yeah,
integrate it, whatever the process is.
sure. Yeah. So in that case, I do come back to a little bit of somewhere between CBT and ACT therapies, radical acceptance and cognitive behavioral, in the sense that for me, when I think of trauma now, I think it's first and foremost important to radically accept that mm, throughout anybody's best efforts, whether they love you or not, or even within yourself, that there will be things that you will experience that will cause you trauma, and that is something that you will be continuously, working with and through maybe your entire life, because there may always be traumas that are, consistently occurring. It'll be what you do with it that determines how your life is going to unfold. I grew up in that very military we don't cry and we don't really talk about emotions kind of thing, even though it was me and two other girls in the family. And I think maybe over time with them that sort of fell away a bit, or perhaps I just internalized all that as don't show emotion because that's not safe in general. But to me, that's all trauma inducing, even when you can't just experience your emotions safely in an environment. And so I think and then as a result, then what you do with that, if you allow yourself to continue to become more closed off and fearful and avoidant of experiencing any of that, it will paint you into a corner, and it absolutely will cause reverberation, more depression, more anxiety, more everything. The only way out is through, in my opinion. And so there's no shame in accepting or recognizing that you've been hurt in any way. No judging or minimalizing about how much or how little. It doesn't matter. It just is. And that to keep trauma from guiding you in certain directions that they seem adaptive, but they're maladaptive. You need to look at it. You need to process it and think, is this something that is preventing me from doing something that might actually be good for me? Or, is it causing me to do things that are not good for me? In the case of a lot of detransitioners, when they talk about trauma they've experienced, they, after having been introduced to gender ideology, they'll um, follow I need to now be the opposite sex because it's my sex that's the problem.
Hmm.
So there's that warped logic that happens, also partially because I believe we're not teaching any of these kids how to critical thinking skills or logic skills or any of that in tandem with emotional regulation skills. So then your brain, being the all powerful thing that it is, will come up with all kinds of solutions in order to avoid that pain. So it's the avoidance of pain that causes us to do all sorts of very, very interesting things. So.
Have you have you developed a relationship to your emotions? Is that a framework? Like, do you have we have strong emotions,
Hmm.
The mind, you seem like a very capable mind. The mind and that right brain, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. Like I can't control this thing. It's coming at me in colors and shapes, and it's not something I can think about, or I can't control it with
Hmm.
thinking. And then
Hmm.
so you stuff it away maybe, and then like trying to integrate that, or trying to form a relationship between that part which analyzes and that part which experiences. Is that a way in which you've developed over the past 6 years or so?
So I'll try to answer that as best as I can, and if I don't answer it well, please let me know.
It's a malformed question or partially formed question.
Okay, sure, yeah, that's okay. I had up until that, roughly 28 years old, up until that point, I had come to see having emotions as a very dangerous thing. They were very unstable. They caused you to do things that were unacceptable. You couldn't trust them. So I had developed heavily into the intellectualizing of everything, and then the complete dissociation and shutting down of all of my emotions as much as I possibly could. Which then the only one that typically remained was anger. So I could express that one quite well, and that makes sense from a therapeutic standpoint, from what we understand about anger typically as an emotion that tends to mask something else that's going on.
Hmm.
um
Were you,
but
did you
now
join like Antifa? Was there some fun
oh no.
thing that you did with your anger?
No, what I did with my anger was typically just work out a
Oh,
lot.
really? Like
Yeah,
marathon or lifting or?
lifting. I did a lot of lifting. Yeah. And so lifting, push-ups, pull up, just that anything that would help to, move that energy, which from what I understand, primal movement and things like that, therapies that are fantastic for masculine leading people is, that more physical work. And of course, there's still the movement of energy through the body. This is getting into the maybe more esoteric or spiritual realms. For feminine people might be, more of the lighter types of yoga or qigong or something like that,
Hmm.
versus the more physical. Or like as a kid, I built so many things from like logs and sticks and wood out in the forest, just like physically manipulating and moving things, heavy things, that were so weird for me as a 5'4" female of 120 pounds. That was strange for a lot of people.
Huh.
But it worked for me working through that. But now I, instead of, recognizing through, again, a lot of that therapy, internal therapy that I did, learning how to emotionally self-regulate and actually expand on these things. Because previously, again, emotions were a scary thing for me. I was given no tools to navigate them whatsoever. I had a mom who, when she broke down, it was just sobbing, crying, and completely hysterical and, dysfunctional. And then I had a father who, when he broke down, you felt like the world
Hmm.
was going to be torn another black hole.
Hmm.
So, I mean, think of pissing off a Marine, and you have an idea of what
Hmm.
actually happens. And I think the only reason why he didn't actually become physically abusive with any of us because we were all female, honestly. I love my father, don't get me wrong whatsoever. I blame neither of my parents for anything that has happened up to this point or for the way that they parented me. I forgive them and I totally understand everything. I just simply understand,
Hmm.
growing up in that environment, when you have those two extremes, you have no model for positive, healthy femininity or masculinity in that way that you go, okay, emotions, no bueno.
Wow. Wow.
And you stay away from them. So
Was there a big age difference between your father and mother?
no, no,
Okay.
2 years.
Okay.
So
So he was
young
19, she's
parents.
17. You're the first?
Hmm. First
Oh,
accident, total accident, of
yeah.
course.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
So
they
yeah,
have to just scramble to make ends meet. Did they have an
right.
extended family? Were you guys
Yeah, so from what I understand, I
support
spent a lot of
groups?
time while my mother was still in her last year of high school. I was being watched by either my father's mother or my mother's mother.
Okay.
And so, yeah, there was a lot of passing the baby around
Hmm.
in that way, and questions I have about that, of course, about attachment theory and how did that affect me, and all
Yeah.
of it really beside the point. It just arrives at wherever I'm at right now. No blame required, just wanting to understand,
Yeah.
really.
And the
So yeah,
military kid life, did you guys move around a lot?
we did, and I do. And one of the conversations that I had with my mother was that she one day she had felt absolutely terrible when I came home, and she asked how I was, doing with school, and that I hadn't. She asked about me making friends, and I said, why bother? Because we're just going to move.
Yeah.
And I don't remember that. I don't remember that conversation. So there's a lot that was going on in my brain at that point that I don't currently have recollection of or connection to, but obviously was very formative for me. But yeah, we moved around a lot.
Hmm.
And so it was all within the United States. So I didn't get any of the cross-cultural experiences that might have been helpful to me at that point.
Hey, are you
But
saying America's a monoculture? Is that what you're suggesting?
I might saying we're not the best is what I'm saying. Yeah, absolutely.
Huh.
So,
Biographically speaking, when did that unwind for you? When did you start to settle down? Or did your early adulthood just perpetuate the pattern of moving around a lot?
no, actually, so after we had finally moved back to the state where I was born, I was there, that's Ohio State. I went there and was there in Ohio for, oh gosh, from that point, probably almost, would it have been almost 15 years or so?
Mm.
So I spent my halfway through middle school, all the way through high school and college in Ohio. So that stayed stable at that point, and I've only since 6 years ago moved out of the state to Florida. Been there ever since. But certainly, I'm looking far more abroad at this point due to your aforementioned um, cultural notation about America. So yeah,
So,
I was going to say to more directly answer your question about how I relate to emotions now. It's very different than the way that I used to dissociate. I do not demonize or find any fault in whatever range of emotions that we have. I do not act on them anymore. I realize I don't have to act on them, and furthermore, when there's an emotion, it's something. It's as if it's a flag for me to go. This is something that needs a little more attention. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong about whatever it is that I'm feeling at that point because feelings are opinions and they can be neither right nor wrong. They just are. It's just something that I need to do a lot more digging into and having these tools that I've learned through the course of my basically self-therapeutic and self-directed education on the matter that I can now, okay, now I've got what I need to actually face these things and look into them and get to the
mm,
bottom of it.
hmm.
So,
I have a question, and it just in my mind, it sounds judgmental, and I don't mean it judgmental. I mean it
okay.
just openly. How
Mhm.
is testosterone or taking testosterone, giving yourself testosterone, is that a way of you loving yourself or not?
Hmm. That's a really good question. Is that a way of loving myself? So long as it still provides me with more benefit than cost,
Hmm.
I do believe so, yes. I am fully open-minded at any point to reevaluate that stance because again, this is an experiment. I know, especially there's a lot more literature on male to female as they call it, but males taking, feminizing hormones and not as much on the other side of that, which I believe have to do with, allowing females now since the Cultural Revolution to do a little bit more exploring in that way openly. So it's less of a known thing. But anyway, I am
Cultural revolution?
sexual revolution. So the
Okay.
60s
Just,
of,
okay.
female liberation. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
I
Sorry.
just want if you're doing like a great leap forward here, to
No, no,
reference or something like
right.
that.
Yeah, right. No, I appreciate you clarifying that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I fully recognize that this is an experiment. My hypothesis is that there's, perhaps some physiological mechanism that makes me uh, better adapted or perhaps more optimally operating in some ways on testosterone. And when that ceases to be the case, then
Hmm.
testosterone ceases to be administered. But I'm also aware of all the, long-term things that could happen. I don't plan on having children. And of course I had a double mastectomy because that was something of an aesthetic choice for me and really has been there. If I think about any dysphoria that's ever been there since day one, that was definitely it. So that was an act of if anything self-expression and I guess what my identity is the way that I see myself visually
Hmm.
appealing to myself
Hmm.
in this particular avatar in this life, even though in the grand scheme for me it's just to play a part, to play a story, to
Mm.
experience something. So for now, yes, testosterone is loving myself, if anything, just to scratch that intellectual itch of just, what if, because that is
Mm.
always
What if what?
always on my mind.
What if what?
What if there is, a physiological basis for sex that we've not yet quite identified, and that, just because someone is born with a certain genitalia doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have hormonal receptors that operate perhaps more optimally for what we expect, of the
Mm.
opposite sex.
Mm.
So
What was the experience of taking tea then for you?
yeah, so for me, I mean, I hate needles, despite having, 50 hours worth of tattooing. I hate needles, and the experience of, and people always say, "Oh, you've got tattoos. You must, not be bothered by needles." No, no, no. It's a very different experience. So I mean, of course, it's taken a long time for me to just get over, the act of giving myself the injection. I've tried intramuscular. That was horrifically painful and traumatizing experience in and of itself. We'll never do that again. So subcutaneous has been my route. Um,
How
but
does that
the
work? Is that like a pouch of leak? Like it just leaks or?
From what I understand, it's you just take adipose tissue, so you put it in some fat tissue. So I had just a little belly fat, put it in there, and then I'm guessing, I think the mechanism is such that because it's within the fat tissue, that it is a much slower diffusion throughout your
Yeah.
entire body versus, of course, intravenously. That would be, very
Oh,
nearly
yeah.
instantaneously. But there are also hormones that, just by their very nature, are much slower acting anyway. They're not, quick like adrenaline is, where it has an immediate effect on your body. From what I understand, testosterone and estrogen are much slower types of hormones to act on your body. So
Hmm.
I think between those two mechanisms, it is a slow release in that way.
How
So
frequently is the dose?
once a week currently
Okay.
for me.
I, I
Yeah. So,
interviewed
but
a intersex man, our disorder of sexual development, James Linehan, and his body either doesn't produce. Yeah, I think for some reason it doesn't produce the testosterone, so he has to take it. And he
mm,
told me the experience was that he takes it once a week. So on Saturday night when he takes his injection, or Saturday,
mm,
he starts
mm,
as a 18-year-old man, and then by Friday he's a 50-year-old man. Like it spikes for him. That
yeah.
it has a very powerful effect. How did it
Yeah,
start to affect you, and how did you adjust to that?
sure. Yeah. So, from that aspect of it, what I did notice initially for those first 3 months, I did have what seemed to be like quick flashes of emotion, whether that be like super excitement, or, would get upset about something, and it wouldn't be in context of anything. I would just be sitting there, and I would get a flash of some kind of an emotion. Okay, that's interesting.
Hmm.
Um, but then again, that lasted very, very briefly in the first 3 months. And even shortly after starting to administer, what I understand is can be a typical experience. I had so much energy. I was so gung ho. I had this drive to just do all kinds of things. And setting sex drive aside, which that's a pretty known, a pretty known effect. Just this absolute, adventurous lust for life,
Hmm.
and focus on being able to do things. I just felt absolutely invincible, unstoppable. Um, and to some degree, that still does happen. For me, I do get in these, modes where that absolutely occurs, less frequently these days. And I think that's just simply a byproduct of age and everything else to be
Hmm.
accounted for.
Hmm.
But in general, I don't notice any major perceptual shifts, honestly,
Hmm.
at this point. So,
And what are other benefits then? Do you feel more comfortable in your skin, or?
yeah, it's interesting. So, just the body shape that I find appealing to myself, more muscular, fat disposition, or I'm sorry, disposition,
Distribution, yeah.
fat distribution. Thank you. In
Yeah.
certain areas, having a much more, chiseled face, less of a round shaped face in general. I particularly for myself admire those qualities, but I've also been kind of a type A personality from the beginning. So for me, I think there's some sort of a natural alignment there, whether that's a cognitive um, conception or it's something that's going on more subconsciously.
Mm,
I'm not really sure, and I
mm,
couldn't really break that apart. But yeah, so just and the facial hair, love it. I wish I could grow more of it. I really do.
mm.
I don't know why. It's just these are things that I've sat and tried to figure out, like from an evolutionary biology standpoint. Like, oh, why would I want more hair? Oh, it's so you can be more rough and rugged and protected, and animals with fur. That's like I don't know any number of theories and hypotheses on that of course I can't even begin to maybe prove or disprove. It's just what I have at the end of the day is just I like this or I don't like this. Why or why don't I? And try to eliminate or include as many things as I can into that, and then just say, okay, well,
Hmm.
that's the best I got. But yeah, the testosterone does help me with those things: the body fat distribution, the more muscular, the face shape, the facial hair, all of those things in general
Hmm.
just contribute to something that I personally aesthetically like for myself. So,
One problematic aspect of medical transition is that it never ends, and it is it can be sort of like an art project that is highly self-referential, but it's like a Achilles in the tortoise or Achilles in the arrow, where you're never going to get there. You're always going to be halfway away from the target, right? In a way, if you get really obsessed with transition, like you can always just be stacking up more and more and more and more things that you
yeah.
can do. The male to the female transition, you could break your clavicles and get more feminine. This redo your voice, do all these different things.
Sure.
What's the limiting principle for you? Are you aware that there is no limiting principle, or like what's enough?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. For me, because I think, because I have this belief that we are eternal. And it is, I
Hmm.
know a lot of people tend to be obsessed with the destination, and this gets more into, I think, the, what would they call it? Philosophical musings about how to go about life in a quote unquote happy way. For me, you can't ever get it wrong because you can't ever get it done. You won't ever get it done. And so I know that for some people, they are obsessed with that, like you said, the end result. How can I get to whatever this ideal that it is? And for me, because I don't have an attachment to that, it's just a one step at a time and then an evaluation at each of those steps without having to put a label or a destination on it. And the tether to reality for me is this undeniably causing me more harm as in, physical detriment. So, like, for example, bottom surgeries. Do I think it would be really fun and useful to have all of that done for me in the way that I like to live my life? Absolutely. um, is it practical with where we're at,
Hmm.
medically speaking? And for me, the answer is absolutely not. I don't have such severe dysphoria that if I do not get this surgery, my life will be absolutely miserable without it. It's
Hmm.
not even close to that. And I do not judge anybody who is at that point, who has dysphoria to that point where it's not touchable by any type of, or I should say, um, it's not bearable enough with any kind of talk therapy or other types of therapy that it's that or bust for them. I understand, and no judgment for me at all on that end of the transsexual experience. But for me, the answer is always a careful consideration of, am I going to experience more negative than positive for me with this? It's not about getting into a box.
Hmm.
Which I think I did a video about that actually, and we might be approaching trans medicine backwards rather than trying to say, do you want to be a boy or a girl or male or female? It's which of these characteristics do you want? Why do you want them? and let's take them one at a time. And I think the problem that a lot of people face with that is that there still is not a ton of acceptance of atypical expressions of male or female or masculinity or femininity. There are people that have a lot of problem with men in dresses or wearing red lipstick out in public. They don't necessarily want to be female, but they like those things. But we as a society, I'm perhaps speaking for people I shouldn't be speaking for, it seems as though people have a very uncomfortable response to that based on, whatever their own experiences or perhaps our natural, evolutionary biology. I don't know. It's different for every person. But this discomfort in being able to accept these different expressions might push people to one box. Am I passing enough? In order to avoid this really uncomfortable in between. And so that's where I think as a society, it may be beneficial for us to have an equal measure, this ability to, reason and logic without going to the snap, emotional judgments, and be able to take people individually and assess it from there versus having this blanket discomfort about these what you might call non-binary expressions. I don't like that word at all for various reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that's what people are getting at is gender non-conformity in so many ways. That people are just either afraid of it, they're disgusted by it, and if we could just talk about it, just why do you feel that way, and not have that other person on the other end feeling, hurt or upset that they're not being accepted. I understand why that is, because a lot of us are running around as little children still wanting to be accepted and loved for who we are. So there's all of that going on at the same time. It's just a bunch of people, in my opinion, with tons of trauma on both ends of it, just trying to get by in their own lives. And to me, I just wish that people could have those conversations, be open about it. But anyway,
Be
that's
the
why
adult
we're
you
here.
want to see in the world or in the room, I guess is the...
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this on my channel or on YouTube or wherever this podcast is being listened to, but you said something about having a penis that is fun and useful, and I understand the fun part, but what do you mean useful? Like just
Yeah,
what
sure.
is
So,
that?
for me, without getting too graphic, as far as my own role sexually,
Okay,
that would be optimal
it would be
for
convenient.
me in my
Yeah.
experience.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. So that useful in that respect. And also it would be fantastic to be able to pee standing up. How functional
No, yeah,
and how
no,
quick is that?
yeah.
Let me tell you, many times where I wish, hunting with all of my dad's friends up, at the cabin, being the only awkward female, and having to try to, in amongst tons of, winter clothes, try to, undress in a certain way and keep everything from getting on you so the deer don't smell you. Like, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, useful in that way would have been great.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. I had to, because he said useful. I'm like, whoa,
I'm
where are we
very
going
glad
here?
I'm very glad you did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what
Because
the
sometimes
tool
I
is.
say things that I don't quite understand their impact in other people's minds, which is why I want them to be able to talk to me. What I say might upset so many people, but please talk to me about it. I'm not going to take somebody's, response to what I say offensively, because ultimately at the end of the day, I know it's based on whatever their experience of things are. And that's nothing personal for me. I am simply evoking, that memory, that response. So I cherish being able to work through those sorts of things with people, because every conversation that I've ever had where I've been able to do that, people have always left it at the end of the day. You can see there's a brevity about them, that they've been able to get this discomfort off of their shoulders because somebody just was willing to listen and not, get angry about what they had to say or feel defensive or anything, which is why, the work that I do, like with parents, dealing with all of this with their children, with the gender ideology and everything, it's amazing to me how many parents are still coming at conversations with their children from that very, themselves very fearful, childlike perspective. And just that being able to shift for them that feeling, give them some trust and confidence and validation for their feelings, being able to see that inner child within them and say, it's okay that you're feeling all of these things. And I know that you're hiding it from your child so that they don't feel that way. You have to work through all of that because your kid feels that. I believe anyway. Your kid feels all of that emotion. It comes out in what you choose to say and all of your body language. And when you're feeling that conflict, they're feeling it. And because children are extremely egocentric, they'll think, I caused this. I did this. This is my fault. And it prevents those conversations from even being able to happen because the kid in a lot of cases will just shut down. And may even internally start to dissociate from all of those conversations and those feelings and those ideas. And now they're cut off from actually being able to access it and work through it. It might seem on the surface like it's okay. But then you might come up against later on down the road, okay, the kid's 18 now and out in that wider world and never got any of those conversations, never got that out, is now legally able to pursue these medicalization aspects. And I've had parents come to me with kids who are, and now they're not kids anymore. They're in their, 19, 20, 21, 22, pursuing all these things before they've had that, prefrontal cortex development. And in that window of time, you can do a lot of damage to yourself. And they can't have these conversations with their children anymore because they're technically adults. And it's so depressing and devastating at that point, which is why I hope that more parents become more aware of their, going back to traumas, of their internal traumas and how that's coming across to their children so that they can have those conversations. It's just absolutely crucial for the generations that are coming up.
Is there an ethical component to you participating in medicalization and that same process being offered to children? Is there an ethical responsibility that you feel that what you are doing is also being done to children? Like, it's the same medical industry. It's the same drug.
Yeah. Can you rephrase that a little bit for me so I know how to?
I'm wondering if you don't think it's proper for children to be medicalized in this way, and it is happening. There's every once in a while there's somebody on Twitter who says that's not happening to children, and you're like, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'll tell you that it is, and we'll see where you are.
Right.
I guess. Okay, let me retract that question and try to get some understanding from a completely other way. Why are you working with parents on this? How did you start working with parents on this?
Yeah, so it happened by complete accident. So I have been posting things on my YouTube channel since I started with this whole transition process. So it's been 5 years now. At first, it started out as somewhat of a vlog type thing where I just, okay, this is my voice 3 months on T, 6 months on T, blah, 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 those sorts of physical changes. And then over time, as I started to, get a little bit more into, as you said, the ethical, philosophical ponderings of that, because my brain just generally tends to work that way. I was the kid that was always asking why this, why that. So it sort of morphed into, I recognize that it seems as though there's a space for adult transsexuals to bring some other perspective to this entire discussion that, as I was seeing played out, politically, socially, medically, did not seem very reasonable at all. That it seemed like activism in that way was getting a lot more attention than what I felt was perhaps a more critical, logical, balanced, even-handed view of this. Okay. And so I started posting a lot more videos about, those sorts of topics. And I started to get parents actually contacting me through the channel saying, I'm having trouble finding therapists who are not gender affirming, who will actually talk to either me or my kid in a way that's going to explore all of this a lot more thoroughly rather than just saying you are what you say you are and we're going to go with the child's direction, essentially under the child's direction. Do you know anybody? And I said, I don't actually know of anybody, and not to mention a lot of therapists have to operate within their state. So there's licensing that says, it's state by state. So you would have to come up with kind of a network in that way. And I hadn't even come close to plugging myself in that way. So I said, I've done a lot of work on myself, and I've consumed an incredible amount on this topic and all the tangential, topics related to this that are framework for understanding this phenomena. I think I can help you. I'm not a licensed therapist, but I think I can give you some support. And before you know it, there were people offering to pay me to do this. They were a bit surprised that it was a transsexual of all people, because in their mind that was somewhat the enemy. So there was a little bit to overcome there for some people, but there were some parents that were just so desperate that after coming to my videos, which had I aim to have a very even-handed perspective on things, that they were willing to overlook that just to get some help. And so that's when I started to, again, really dig into all of this and realize that because I'm not licensed in some ways, and people know full well up front that I'm not, that I am able to perhaps offer some help in some ways that a licensed therapist their hands would be tied, again, with the whole, gender affirming, being fearful of losing a license, that sort of thing. So there's a full disclaimer up front. And as so far with who I've worked with, the vast majority of them have just been appreciative to have, additional, support.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of answers what I was trying to flesh out. Pardon me, something in my throat. Because how I got into this topic was watching the activists, very radical college activists, claiming to speak for all transsexuals. And in that claim, being able to just completely act like spoiled brats and get their way and manipulate people in the name of transsexuals. And then also, once you start to look at the effect that activism has had on the medical industry, on the psychological associations, the pediatric associations, you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not proper. So you have to disambiguate between the medical procedures, the consequences of all that, and then this political social movement. And you, as somebody, which goes back to my first question, at the beginning, is like, okay, you have this thing that you're pursuing or doing, that is transition. You're transitioning somehow. And that is a medical procedure, and it's a personal procedure, and it has psychological implications, and you're doing it for these reasons, and you have all this reasoning behind it. But that same thing is a political identity. The same set of procedures is being foisted upon 11-year-old girls, boys, leading to, lifelong medical issues, and then being promoted as like the brand new civil rights, the forefront of civil rights. And then you have like the evidence of like somebody like Jazz Jennings, whose whole life has been derailed by that, and then propped up as like the poster, literally the poster child of Born in the Wrong Body. And then you see what happens when that body is being messed with. So I guess just naturally from what you're saying, you ended up filling in that gap. You ended up speaking out or filling in order to say, these people who are claiming the trans identity and then foisting, maybe some sort of like transhumanist communism on everybody are not representative of everybody. And so like your ethical impulse is to fulfill the role of being the reasonable tranny, if that is
I know it sounds so self-important, doesn't and egotistical to say that I'm a reasonable tranny. And I hesitate. I hesitate with that label. I look at it just as deploying critical thinking.
Yeah.
Is really what it boils down to. And for me, I guess there was one thing that you had mentioned I perhaps wanted to clear up is that whole idea of transitioning. I viewed it quite differently in the sense that I there was never necessarily an attempt to transition. There was never necessarily the I'm going to do this. It was okay, could testosterone help me in any number of ways with its effects? Yes. Okay. Let's set aside that it's, a hormone that we typically associate with sex in general, even though both males and females have it within them.
Mm.
It was, can this improve my life? And, will I enjoy the side effects? Never mind how the rest of the world is going to perceive that. Because I think that's what kind of gets people turned backwards,
Hmm.
is that they're looking with an external locus of control, external focus rather than the internal. It's
Hmm.
how is everybody else going to see me versus, how do I want to see myself ultimately at the end of the day? And I understand you can't always separate the two because it's difficult bumping against society consistently who doesn't quite understand your nuance or your novelty. Like that's just, as you said, kind of a cross to bear with someone who is taking these sorts of steps is that, and of course, it's never guaranteed that you're going to
Hmm.
end up on the other end with all these hormones that looks like something that a person across the room can go, oh, it's a male or that's a female. You're not guaranteed any of that at all. You might just end up in that ambiguous space forever. And then you have to contend with that too. So for me, I came to it completely separating, those framework, from looking at it and just taking it one step at a time, which I know it might be difficult for some people, but that's just the way my brain has worked now that I'm actually using it instead of just,
Mm.
trying to fit in,
Hmm.
So,
What's your future looking like? What's your calling at this point in
well,
time?
yeah, so I am immensely fulfilled with every single interaction that I have with someone in the exploration of their identity or somebody that they love's identity. So parent to child, or within someone who is exploring who they are through that framework. And the conversations that I have with them, just being present and non-judgmental and being able to look at things from a very coldly, objectively logical perspective. The feelings will be something that we can work through as they come up, but to be able to separate the two, not that one is better than the other, they will work in tandem if if you have the right tools to navigate that. But currently, like I said, I found great fulfillment in these conversations. So I love working with parents and their children on this. Maybe partly because it's not something that I personally received as a child. It's something that would have been great for me, and so to sort of live vicariously over and over and over
Mm.
again, being able to give parents, those tools. Because I am not of the, I want to talk to the kid first. That is not my MO. That's not how I go. Most of what you need can be found out, through the parent first. You can get all of that and then give the parent the tools to talk to the kid, or you can have the both of them, together in the session. And because I certainly don't want to lead any child astray in any way. I believe that's the realm of, the parent. You birthed the child, that is your legacy. And I'm just here to help in whatever way that I can with that. So I want to continue doing more work with, parents in that respect, and perhaps even late in life people who come out to this ideology and who have seen 60-year-olds transitioning to, and that's wonderful for them that they don't feel that it's too late. They can still get some, great enjoyment out of their life with that. And I do the public events as well. So I have an entire, booth set up with a big old banner on the front that says, I'm transgender, let's chat. And I just put myself out there in, whatever event will have me. for people to just come up and talk to. I've had the most amazing conversations with people through, my channel and through that in person. I mean, could you call that activism? I don't really know. It's
Hmm.
boots on the ground kind of, grassroots sort of project and movement. But
Yeah.
it's so gratifying to me, and I would love to be able to do that full time and continue to write. Currently, I'm working on a packet of information that's sort of as neatly as possible brings everything for parents of children who are experiencing this, gender questioning, bringing that information to one place for them to kind of, crash course essentially. I know that there are therapists out there. You had on your podcast a couple of days ago the mother whose public school was attempting to transition her daughter, and she talked about Sasha Ayed's work. I looked into that a little bit, and so I know that there are therapists out there who are actually doing that monthly membership support group for ongoing things, because
Hmm.
it will be an ongoing thing. Um, but I'm contributing in as many ways as I possibly can to this, because I see this as something that it's not going away. This questioning of ourselves through the lens of sex and gender, now that there is starting to be more acceptance of this sort of exploration of self, it's not going away, I don't think. Not for many, many generations. It's going to be something that we will learn to navigate as human beings. So for me, this kind of work, I feel will be needed for quite some time, as our society adjusts to this way of questioning and navigating and socializing and all those things. I see it on a much, much bigger scale. So.
Hmm. You're writing a packet, not a book, but a packet.
Yeah, so I'm writing so the packet is
Does
kind of,
it
I guess
have
you could call it like a
like
course.
little
So
erasers in it, or little doodads and stuff like that?
there will be things like, worksheets and questions and things like that in there, but then also just, blocks of information or exercises that you can do, for yourself as a parent to, develop more emotional regulation skills. Because like I said, I know most of us didn't get that education, and we're still suffering for it today.
Hmm.
So, bringing all that together as succinctly as possible. I am also writing an actual book
Okay. There we go.
that is tangential to this, which is all about the process
Transgenital
of.
to it.
Yeah, hey, that's good. I like that. Dad puns, love them. Yeah, it's so the
It's
book, it'll
one
be.
of the fringe benefits of testosterone.
Yeah, I love it. Um, so the book is more about how to get all of these life skills and transcend your garbage, essentially, the trauma and everything from the beginning. All of those things that we just were not taught how to do,
Hmm.
undo all of the trauma as much as possible, and then move forward with a better foundation. The book will be called "You Are Here," and it'll be all about not me, but the skills and things and the process that I used to unwind all of this, and then lay that foundation for myself. I guess you could call it a self-help book. But I remember when I started going through all of this, I just thought, why isn't there like a manual of life? I need like an instructional booklet of life. Why can't I just go here, read this thing, and you'll be able to kind of do well enough, And because I know it sounds maybe silly because life isn't that simple, but there's absolutely a foundation for which I believe might be helpful, to a great number of people. Of course, everybody's individual. You'll come about it in different ways. Um, but that's what I'm working on tangentially to this, crash course for parents dealing
Hmm.
with that with their children. So and of course, just working a regular 9 to 5 job.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's
Yeah.
slow going, but
Yeah.
it'll get there.
And I was going to ask about formal schooling, if you have any interest in that.
So uh, formal schooling. I will definitely be attending more conferences and, perhaps more, like you said, formal education on the matter. With having gone through as much as I have informally, the depth and the level to which I have, I do feel that it is sufficient at this point to begin offering help. And continuing education is a must. It doesn't matter how much you think you know, there is always something more to learn.
Hmm.
And then as we understand more, then you update your understandings about stuff. And that's another thing is being humble and willing to admit that whatever, framework that you have, it may not be the one that 15, 20, 30 years from now would be the accepted framework, i.e. Freud and all
Hmm.
his ideas.
Hmm.
So it's a constant experiment, and realizing that will go a long way, and reconciling with that will go a long way. But anyway, yes, there's some interest in more formal education on the matter. So
Is Artemis your given name or your chosen name?
no, I chose that actually very, very specifically. There's quite the story behind that. But I did choose that name, or rather, I should say it chose me. Actually,
Hmm.
I had asked. I was on my motorcycle driving to work one day because I had known that I wanted to change my
Of
name,
course,
and
you're on a motorcycle.
yeah, yeah, love my bike. And that was the place where I could just kind of, it was a meditative sort of state for me. And so I just asked myself, what name do I want? And quite literally, it just dropped into my head because I had tried the method of, oh, look at the baby names and look at, all kinds of just everything. Like what characters do you like? And just try to go through this process. And it was just grueling. And I was so sick of it. So I just finally, on my bike one day just said, I just want a name, just some inspiration, and it literally just popped into my head. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want, primarily because I know it to be a name that generally is perceived as gender neutral. And I wanted those sorts of conversations with people. I, perhaps rather mischievously, didn't want to give that away, a gender or anything. I didn't want to influence somebody in that way initially. And I wanted to see how they would respond to that name, especially during that whole transition period. Is very interesting. Um,
Hmm.
and so, for anybody paying attention or that knew the mythology behind the name, they would know that actually Artemis is a female goddess, and she is one of two. She's twins with Apollo. And so, for me, that whole duality, the masculine, feminine, and the strength of nature of Artemis, the mythological goddess, just everything about it was just absolutely resonated with me. And I
Hmm.
didn't know all of that before the name just popped into my head. So it just flowed so nicely. So
Hmm.
yeah, I love it that it's not something, the name itself doesn't give anything away to people. So it almost strips away a layer of subconscious bias that's just so tickling to me,
Hmm.
that now I get to see, something of someone's response to me outside of that initial, what's your name? So
What was Artemis? Was she's divination, owl? What's
yeah,
they always have a nasty side. Those Greek gods
yeah,
and goddesses.
Diana. So she Diana, goddess of the
Moon.
hunt.
Yeah.
Um, yes, yep, the hunt or the moon, yep, both of
Okay.
those, depending Roman or Greek, which aspect you're looking at it. And she was rather what should we say? Sharp in some ways. So she actually severely punished. I think it was Actaeon. Can't remember a mortal that happened to come across her while she was bathing,
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
naked, right,
Yep.
and punished him mercilessly for that, and was herself. She had a harem, apparently a following of females, although she never supposedly, was active in that way sexually with any one of them. Somewhat aloof and untouchable in that way. Rather mysterious, but could be rather vengeful. So
Hmm.
yeah, that I believe that to be her, mm, her darky side. So
What's greatest in life?
what's greatest in life? Oh, I can't even begin to answer that question. If you mean for myself, what's greatest in life for myself? Is that what you mean?
Sure.
Sure. Or what do you mean? Because I've become much more careful about asking very specifically what it is that someone means when they ask me something, because when you're in this realm, being in talking about transgender ideology or transgender in general, there are so many different definitions and ideas about what it is. And when people say, I am non-binary, I am transgender, I this or I that, they have their own idea of what that is when they communicate it. And so it's very, very easy to misinterpret and then answer in such a way that doesn't actually communicate that you are understanding someone, or that you're, attempting to connect in that way. And it can be rather alienating. So
Hmm.
I'm more careful to ask, what do you mean? So what's greatest in life? Yeah, I can't presume to even answer that question, because it'll be different for every individual, and for each individual, it's a beautiful story.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't dare to presume to say what's greatest.
Well, if you were a real man, you would quote Conan the Barbarian and say, to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the
Right,
lamentations of
yeah.
their women.
Yeah, right. To the horizon, matey. Yeah, absolutely. Understand that completely, which is why it's I pull back, because I'm more interested in hearing what other people have
What
to
brings
say about
you
those things.
joy then?
What brings me joy? What brings me joy is, however small or for brief a period of time, giving somebody some respite or relief from the tension that life generally is for a lot of people. If you don't thoroughly adopt the Wu Wei principle, the art of just being, which I suppose, unless you're an ascended master, that's really not not reasonable to think or expect. Um, just those brief moments of respite in conversation with people, giving them that little moment,
Hmm.
for me is where it's at, because that's and a lot of people will feel that we are but a ship on the sea, and it can be very lonely and isolating sometimes. Again, that
Hmm.
hero's journey, and so those little moments, they give you enough to keep going. So that is what I live for.
Hmm.
So
And where can people find your content?
yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, Tea Time with Artemis, and I also now have an official website
Hmm.
for the coaching. I guess you could call it coaching. I loathe to call it coaching, because that seems to have such
Yeah, my lady has a problem with that word
connotation.
too. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
sweaty.
hate it. So it's yeah, and among so many other things too. So I have a website, withinguidance.com,
Hmm.
and that is where I offer people to read a little bit about what I do on that, the guidance aspect, since it's not technically counselorship, no licensure there.
Hmm.
They can find me there, or of course through the YouTube channel. So that currently is, or if you're in Central Florida, occasionally I'll have events. I don't announce when I'm going to be there beforehand, because of, for potential safety reasons. I don't
Yeah,
need anybody thinking ahead of time. But
you just show up with a
yeah,
booth and a packet.
that's precisely what, and a setup that's very inviting. So I am told, where there are two cups for tea, to and comfortable living room chairs for people
Mm.
to sit
Hmm.
down and have a very, very, as you termed, a conversation regarding
Yeah.
a typically hot button
Well,
topic.
you could be
So
an art. Not every activist needs a soapbox. You can just have a love seat. The love seat activist.
I really like that. I might have to think about that one.
Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for reaching out, and I'm really impressed with your work. And it's great to kind of co-ruminate with you about this and open it up. And links to your work will be down there in the description. I highly suggest people check out your stuff, and maybe you could consider doing podcast versions of your stuff if people are into podcasts.
I have been told that so many
We
times.
can
Do a
talk about it
podcast, do a
after the
podcast.
recording.
So
Yeah, well,
yes,
it's really
yes.
easy. I'll tell you how to do it off the
Beautiful.
recording.
Yes. I
Thank you
would
very
love
much.
to. Yes. Thank you, Ben. It's been a
Right on.
pleasure, truly.
Absolutely. And that's the recording. I like to dive in and